Okay, now we go to Frege's greatest, well, a lot of people think his greatest discovery, and that is his invention of the predicate calculus. And his invention of the predicate calculus rested on having a different conception of language than the one that people had had going back to Aristotle. In Aristotelian logic, all men are mortal, some men are mortal, Socrates is mortal. All of those are of the same form. They're the subject-predicate form. Frege saw that's wrong. The way Socrates is mortal functions is quite different from the way all men are mortal, some man is mortal function. There was always an embarrassment for the Aristotelian view. How about no men are mortal? How the hell does that work? If Socrates refers to Socrates and all men refers to all men and some men refers to some men, what does nobody, no man, what does that refer to? Well, that was an embarrassment, and Frege got us out of that embarrassment. So take, what case did I use here? If we take, I've been using Socrates and bald. If we take Socrates is bald, and we knock out Socrates, we get X. And now that's no longer a sentence. This is an incomplete expression. But now watch. You can complete it by adding there is an X such that X is bald. And we now use this notation for that. There is an X such that X is bald. Now, look at this. We had an incomplete expression, an open sentence, something that was not a sentence at all. But you can complete it not only by sticking the name of a guy in there, but by putting a quantifier. And Frege says that you can say there is an X such as bald, or you can say for all X, X is bald, everybody is bald. By putting in the name of the quantifier function, there is an X such that, or for all X, X is such that, you completed the original not by naming an object, but by referring to another function. So existence, says Frege, is a second-level function. It's a Begriff, all right, but it's a zweite Stufe. It's an upstairs function. It's a second-level function. Now, that doesn't sound like it's a very big deal, but it's very important in the entire history of philosophy because it makes it clear why existence is not a predicate like any other. See, people are willing to say, well, existence is not a predicate. Kant famously said that. But grammatically, it obviously is. Horses exist, their functions as a predicate. What he meant was it's not a predicate of objects. What is it a predicate of? It is a predicate of concepts. And the sentence, horses exist, says there is an X such that X is a horse. And what that tells you is that the concept, I'm talking Frege talk now, the concept horse has instances. Now this is immensely important in the history of philosophy because there's a very bad proof that has a very long history. It's called the ontological proof for the existence of God. It was originally invented by Saint Anselm when Anselm lived in the 9th century. Check that out on Google, your scholarly resource here. Saint Anselm invented a notorious proof for the existence of God, and here's how it went. God is that being greater than which cannot even be thought. Okay, now ask yourself, does God exist or not? Well, suppose he doesn't exist. Then something greater could be thought, right? The same guy only existing. Sorry about that. I call him a guy. An entity. Then an entity could be conceived greater than that, namely the same entity only existing. And you'd be surprised what a long and prodigious history this was. And Descartes cleaned it up a bit, but it's just as bad in Descartes. In Descartes, here's how it goes. God is that being who, by definition, is perfect. What is a perfect being? Well, obviously, a perfect being is a being that has all of the perfections, right? Okay, now ask yourself, does God exist or not? Well, it follows immediately God must exist, because if God didn't exist, then he would certainly have one very grave imperfection, namely non-existence. That's a hell of an imperfection, non-existence. So God must exist, otherwise we wouldn't satisfy the definition. By definition, God exists. And the way this is supposed to work rhetorically is this. Take the atheist, the fool who hath said in his heart there is no God, and ask him, define your terms. What do you mean by God? And he has to agree. God is by definition a perfect being. And what is a perfect being? What does that mean? Well, it must mean a being that has all the perfections. Now ask yourself, does God exist or not? Assume he does not exist, then you get an absurd result. God would have an imperfection, non-existence. Ask the whole class, who would prefer existence to non-existence, or non-existence to existence, and you'll get the result that existence is definitely, I mean, there may be a couple of suicidal nuts in the class, but in general, you'd get the result that existence is a perfection. But since God has all the perfections, God must exist. Now, throughout history, people have been suspicious of this. Aquinas, to his credit, saw that it was fishy. And Kant said, existence isn't a predicate. Oh yeah? Why not? I mean, it certainly is grammatically a predicate. What he should have said, and what Frege enables us to say, which nobody could say before, existence is not a property of objects. If I'm asked to list the properties that an object has, I cannot list existence. I write letters of recommendation all the time. And how? God. And so I write a letter and I say, Sally is very hardworking and produces cogent and original essays in her philosophy classes, and she exists. There's something fishy about that, because all of the stuff that I wrote before presupposes her existence. So what is existence? It is not a property of objects. And now you can't, for reasons Frege gave us, you can't just say flat out, it's a property of concepts. But what you can say is every statement of existence is a statement about a concept, because when I say there is some x such that x is bald, that says bald things exist, that says this concept has instances. The concept is instantiated. So what happens in existential statements when I say horses exist? The subject part expresses a concept, and the predicate part tells you whether or not the concept has instances. Now let me go through this slowly in a way that Frege didn't, but I think I want to make it clear to you. Take sentences of the form horses exist or dogs exist, and ask yourself, how do they work? Well, the first thing you can say is existence is not a property of objects. But then another way to say that is, in existential statements such as horses exist, the subject expression does not refer to objects, and then the predicate expression says of them whether or not they exist. The subject expression can't refer to objects, because if it did, then you'd have to presuppose that the statement was true in order to state it. You see, if you think horses exist refers to horses and says of them that they exist, then you've got to suppose horses exist in order that you can refer to them. So two ways of saying the same thing. In existential statements, the predicate of statement doesn't ascribe a property to an object or objects, but the subject expression, horses exist, doesn't refer to an object or objects. Well, what's going on in existential statements? Frege was the first person to see that. And what he says is, what's going on is that in horses exist, the expression horses expresses a concept, and the predicate expression exists tells you whether or not there are any instances of that concept. Or as he puts it, existence is a second-level concept. Existence is not a property of objects, but you can't say this quite in Frege, but you can see what it's trying to say. Existence is a property of concepts, Or rather, as Frege put it more carefully, any statement of existence is a statement about a concept. It says that the concept has or does not have instances. Horses exist and dragons do not exist. Each of those expresses a concept and then says whether or not the concept has instances. Now, this is going to be very important for Frege's whole philosophy of mathematics, because the quantifier expressions, there is an x, and for all x, x is such that, those are referred to concepts at the second level. Begriff of the zweite Stufe. I always forget if it's der zweiten Stufe or zweiter Stufe, but anyway, it's a zweite Stufe up there. My German is pretty imperfect, as those of you who speak German will have noticed. Okay, so this is an important discovery, and now he's going to go on and say, now, number expressions are also second-level expressions. Every number is a complete object. But, of course, statements of number, there are 6 horses in the barn. What the 6 there does is refer to a concept, and the statement, there are 6 horses in the barn, says the concept horse in the barn is 6 times instantiated. So 6 there is a predicate not of an object, but of a predicate, horses in the barn, and it says that concept, horses in the barn, is instantiated 6 times. Okay, now this is actually a deep and important discovery. That the quantifier expressions, for all x, x is such that, and the existential quantifier, there is an x such that, and number expressions like 5 and 4 and the square root of 8, all of those are concept expressions, but at the second level. They're concepts of the zweite Stufe, of the second level, because they take as arguments not actual ground-level objects like dogs and cats, but other concepts. Okay, so for the first time in Frege, we get an analysis of existential statements. Now look, I didn't even get all the way through this, but we're getting there. I got enough time to get through the rest of this, I think. Where are we? We're up to the back page. So there is an x such that x is a horse, or in quantifier expressions, there is an x such that horse x. By the way, the notation that we use, this backward E and the upside down A, that's not due to Frege. Frege had an elaborate diagram, and people who've learned it say it's lovely. You know, they talk about it the way people talk about Apple computer. I mean, they think it's just wonderful. I've never used one, so I don't know. But in any case, what we now use is a notation that was originally invented by Giuseppe Peano, a great Italian logician. And he didn't actually use the upside-down x, but basically the notation that we use for quantification is due to Peano. Okay, now we get to another important claim in Frege, which has been very influential. Expressions with the same reference can be substituted for each other without loss or change of truth value. That's Leibniz's law, and you know that now. But in indirect contexts, that is, sentences preceded by such words as Sam believes that or Sally said that, words have their indirect sense and their indirect reference. The indirect reference of a sentence is its customary sense, a thought, and its indirect sense is the sense of the words, the thought that, or the proposition that. So what we really mean when we say Sally believes that Socrates is bald is Sally believes the proposition that Socrates is bald. But now that has a weird consequence, namely, words systematically change their meanings and their reference when they're prefaced by something. Sally said that. John believes that. All of those produce indirect context, and because of the indirect context, you have an indirect sense. Ungerader Sinn. I love speaking German in public because it sounds authoritative. Ungerader Sinn und ungerader Bedeutung, because you get an indirect sense, you get an indirect reference, and the indirect reference of a word is its customary sense. So really, when you say John believes that Barack Obama is president, Barack Obama there doesn't refer to Barack Obama. It refers to the sense of the expression Barack Obama. And this is one of those great disasters in the history of philosophy that we're still recovering from. Okay, well, we pretty nearly, well, let's see, we didn't quite get through that. All right, now we're going to get his conception of compositionality. But I want to, before we still got 1 or 2 minutes, don't we? I want to introduce a couple other notions. Frege says the key to understanding language is sense and reference, but there are 2 other notions he introduced that are important. He had a kind of primitive notion of illocutionary force, and he even used the notion of force. He says the force of the sentence leave the room addressed to John will be different from the force of John will leave the room. Both have the proposition that John will leave the room, but the first has the force of an order, and the second, John will leave the room, has the force of a statement. So there was a kind of very primitive notion of illocutionary force, and I've often wondered if Austin didn't get the idea from Frege, because he actually translated an important book of Frege into English. Another notion that Frege had, which is important, is the notion of tone. And Frege says the sentence, John is poor and John is honest, have the same sense and reference as John is poor but John is honest, but the word but lends a different tone there. There's a kind of contrast implied by the but, which you don't get with and. The meaning is the same. The reference of and is the same as but, because it's true that John is poor but honest the truth of John is poor but honest will be exactly the same as the truth conditions of John is poor and honest. But the flavor, the tone is different, because with but you imply a contrast. And it's very interesting that we do have these words that don't affect truth, but function crucially in language. Other languages have them. The favorite German is doch. And if you speak German, I'd like you to explain what doch means anyhow. There are lots of books written about what doch means. Nobody knows. And the French have a wonderful word used to express disagreement. Si. Mais si, meaning you're dead wrong about that. Okay, I'll go on with all this on Thursday.